Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and our merch and partner products. I'm going to be doing some live events in the near future, a mix of storytelling and somatic therapeutics, some meditation and habit building. So now is a great time to join our newsletter through the link in our notes. Let's hang out. Hello, my dears. I don't know what your day is like today, but I am sending you wishes for ease and small moments of joy. And I'm hoping that this little break you are taking right now to listen to some stories, notice how your body feels, helps. Stories, fiction, reading, whether it's from a book or through your ears, inspires empathy. It activates our neural structures, helps us understand emotion as if it were ours. So not only can stories soothe us, they can teach us to soothe each other. So hey, maybe share this show with a friend. And reminders that if you need this, but for sleep, we've got that. It's called Nothing Much Happens. Find it on any podcast app. And if you stick around after the show, I'll fill you in a bit on how these stories connect to others we've heard, and my general ramblings about my process and such. But before we set out, let's take a deep breath in through the nose. Let it out with a sigh. Again, fill it up. And release. Good. Our stories today take us through the blooms and births of spring. We'll start with Mother Nature, visiting the daffodils on the front porch and the lemons on the counter, and finding a through line that connects us all. Then we'll meet new friends at Weathervane Farm, where baby animals are wobbling about in the fresh hay, and the air is full of sunshine and birdsong. Finally, we will drive out to the Tulip farm and fill a basket with fresh-cut blooms. Mother Nature. When the spring flowers and the blossoming trees had started to bloom in the first wave of early spring, it was all in shades of yellow. The forsythia, the buttercups, and the daffodils. Then that second wave came a few weeks later in tones of purple. The eastern redbud trees, whose thin violet-sheathed branches seemed to poke out from between every other tree. Grape hyacinths and periwinkle vines winding around the fence posts in the yard. Then the dam burst open, and pink cherry blossom petals were raining down in the park. The bright white flowers of oleanders and dogwoods, and the deep blue of wisteria were turning my daily walks into technicolor dreams. Not to say that the daffodils were done blooming. I had a patch by my front door, and when I stepped out to bring in the mail, I squatted down beside them to admire their sunny yellow color. I noticed that their leaves had soft, rounded tops like butter knives, and their stems grew in a flattened spiral shape. Someone had told me once that our bones grew, not in straight lines, but in spirals. That the calcium was layered into the matrix in twisting patterns, the same as you might see in the coil of a conch shell, or the spinning helix of our DNA. I had no idea if it was true, but I guess that even if it wasn't, the feeling that Mother Nature's fingerprints were visible as a repeating pattern through all the world, I supposed the universe. Here I thought of the spiral of the Milky Way. Well, it felt true enough. In my kitchen, there was more yellow. I had 3 perfect Meyer lemons in a bowl on my countertop. They'd cost more than their common cousins, but when I'd seen them in the grocery store, they just looked so lovely and full of promise. I couldn't help but add them to my cart. They were a little less round, more oblong, and with smooth skin that was almost orange. I pushed open the window over the sink and let fresh air into the kitchen while I tied my apron strings around my waist. I'd had a look through my recipe books, trying to decide what to make with these special lemons. I'd seen recipes for lemon curd and lemon poppy seed loaves, for glazed lemon scones, and small round sugar cookies with paper-thin slices of candied lemon on top. But in the end, I went for the classic, lemon bars. Tart and sweet, with an oatmeal base that made them the perfect companion to an afternoon cup of tea. They also wrapped up easily in parchment paper and were good for sharing. Through the open window, I saw my neighbor, 1 foot up on his lawnmower, pulling the cord in sharp, swift movements to get the engine turning. Soon it came to life, and he began to crisscross the yard in tidy diagonal lines. The scent of fresh-cut grass was wafting into the kitchen, and I set my measuring spoons down for a few moments to breathe it in. They say that our sense of smell is more closely connected to memory than any other. And again, it was something that sure felt true, even if I wasn't sure that it actually was. Fresh-cut grass took me right back to the summers of my childhood, to riding my bike up and down the streets of my neighborhood with trading cards stuck in the spokes, to lunches eaten at whoever's house we happened to be playing at the moment, to standing barefoot on the warm cement of the driveway with a piece of pastel chalk in my hand, and smelling a charcoal barbecue lighting up in someone's backyard while dogs barked and music played from inside. I thought about what I might have been drawing with that chunk of sidewalk chalk. Almost certainly the sun, flowers, and trees. I think for lots of kids, these are the first things that we draw. Even when we draw a house, family, and pets, there's almost always a sun tucked into the corner of the page, with squiggly lines of light coming down, and a carpet of grass and flowers. And now in my kitchen, I was mixing up something sunny and bright again. Another portrait, this one made with fruit and oats, but showing Mother Nature's fingerprints all the same. I pressed the oat mixture, sweetened with maple syrup from my aunt's own trees, into the bottom of a low baking dish, and used a rounded coffee mug to flatten it out and work it evenly around the sides. I blind baked the crust for a bit, just till it was a light golden brown, and then took it out to cool while I prepared the filling. I carefully zested my 3 lemons, rasping the soft peel into tiny curled threads. I'd lived once in a place known all over the world for their lemon groves, which grew in steps all along the cliffs of rocky mountains beside the sea. The lemons there grow as big as softballs and hung from trees in every backyard and park and square patch of greenery beside the freeway. They went into nearly every meal in some form or another. They were made into drinks and desserts and squeezed onto salads. They were medicine and perfume. They were painted onto ceramics, stitched into fabrics, carved onto shop signs, and tattooed onto forearms. It was the same, again, as me in the driveway with my piece of chalk, as kids with their crayon drawings, the twisting daffodil stems, and the spiraling DNA. Another portrait of Mother Nature. I poured the filling into the crust and smoothed it with my offset spatula. The dish went back into the oven, and I reached for my kitchen timer on the windowsill. I'd found it at a garage sale. It was the exact one my grandmother had had in her kitchen, with a red plastic casing and a big dial on the front. I had a memory of her putting several things into the oven at once, picking up the timer and closing her eyes to do some mental math, then confidently twisting the dial to the right spot and setting it down as we went to lay the table or dress a salad. I did my own bit of math, realizing I'd been lost in the memory for a minute or two, then set the timer and started washing up the dishes. Soon the kitchen smelled of lemon and vanilla and that good sweet maple syrup. I got out my roll of parchment paper, a well-honed chef's knife, and a spool of blue and white striped twine. When the timer rang, I took out my lemon bars and set them near the open window to cool. I'd cut them and wrap some for giving away to friends and neighbors. Oh, I'd save one for the mail carrier who'd brought me a heavy box the day before. Next door, the lawn was cut, and I thought about how the spring yellows had given over to purples and pinks, and now to the deep summer green that would be with us till autumn. Of course, Mother Nature's touch wasn't just in the colors and shapes and spirals. It showed up when a mama dog took in a lost kitten to nurse, or when a lotus blossom pushed through mud to get to the sunlight, or when any of us tended to any other one, when we carried each other forward, put an arm around a shoulder, healed a hurt, or fed a need. It was more of us being her. It was coming home. New friends at Weathervane Farm. We were up early today, not just because the birds were having an all-comers talent show and sing-off in the branches, though certainly they were, and had been at it since well before the sun rose. No, we were up early because there were a lot of furry and feathered folks to check on. Our little farm sanctuary had been growing over the last few years, from the first goats and pig who'd come here to relax into their retirement years, to the donkeys, cows, ducks, and geese, among others, who'd joined us since. We'd met and fallen in love with a lot of animals, and in the last few days, our family had grown even more. We set out in our barn clothes and rubber boots. I couldn't remember when I'd last worn anything else, and tromped across the yard. I slid open the big barn door to a chorus of calls from our residents who were all ready for breakfast and to get out into the sun on this lovely spring day. We usually started with the stalls closest to the door and went in order down one side and back up the other. And our animals certainly knew that, but things had changed a few days before, and we sure heard about it as we went straight back to the farthest pen. We couldn't help it. We had baby goats, twins that had been born early in the morning 3 days ago. They were black, with a few white and brown spots, and we told them apart because one, the little girl, had right on top of her head a white spot that looked like a smudged thumbprint. And I liked thinking about her genetic blueprint, coding that special part of her while she waited to be born. We'd had volunteers watching over her mom nearly around the clock in the days before she gave birth. And since they had been the ones to go without sleep, we'd let them name the twins. The little girl was called Geraldine, and her brother, Topper. I don't know where those names had come from, but they seemed to fit the kids, and our farm in general. We went with the flow here, rolled with whatever came, like the Weathervane did on top of the barn. When we peeked over the edge of the stall, we found them both huddled with their mom having breakfast. Their mom was so good and patient with them. I'd been there as they were born, and even in her exhaustion, she cleaned them and brought them close. They were thriving under her care, and I was already a bit nervous about the trouble these new kids would get into. Goats are just built different. Of all the animals here at Weathervane, the goats are the silliest, the cleverest daredevils. They climb on anything, jump off everything, tried to eat whatever fit in their mouth and some things that didn't. They're all so sweet and loving. It's just that comes after the chaos. After we'd checked in with the goats and had filled the troughs with feed, replenished their water, and opened the door that led them out into their yard, we went back to the front of the barn and started our normal morning chores. Geraldine and Topper weren't the only new babies here at the farm, but they were the ones with the potential to cause the most trouble, so they got the first look of the day. In the stall by the front, we opened the door and ushered the ducks and geese out to their yard for breakfast. At the end of the waddling line came a couple tall fawn and white runner ducks, with a tiny row of ducklings behind them. They were so adorable, I couldn't stand it. I wanted to scoop them up and bring their downy little bodies close to my face. I resisted. Their parents were watching closely as each little duck tottered down the ramp at the front of the barn and into the grass. They'd spend the morning pecking in the yard, then testing out the pond as the ducklets learned to swim. We had several types of ducks here, but don't tell anyone this, the runners were my favorite. They stand upright like penguins, and they really do run, a little clumsily, but still they are speedy. We kept making our way through the barn, feeding, watering, cleaning, raking out straw, bringing in fresh, sweet-smelling bales to replace it. Our cows, Winnie the Moo and his mom, whom we called Frida, went out to have a good scratch on the brushes we'd installed on the fence post. The pigs were happy to see us and wagged their tails as we brought their breakfast. That's when the braying from the little coffle of donkeys got really loud. They'd been patient, waiting their turn for breakfast and playtime, but they'd had enough and were hee-hawing loudly. Even before I rounded the wall that edged their pen, I had a wide smile on my face. Our donkeys Bumblebee and Turnip had their first foal a month before. His name was George, and his soft gray fur reminded me of the ducklings' fuzzy down. I went straight into their pen, and they all crowded around me begging for pets on their long noses. If the goats were the silliest farm residents, the donkeys were the most affectionate. If we let them, they'd sleep in the house with us, curled up trying to share beds with the dogs. Baby George, still a bit shy, stood back behind Bumblebee, and only after I'd been in with them for a few minutes, slowly trotted forward to have his own head scratched. Out we went into the yard, and George ran out into the sun. Since he'd figured out running, he'd been showing it off, speeding up and down the length of the barnyard, braying and kicking up dirt. His auntie Muriel, a small donkey whose coloring was for some reason called roan and broken, meaning brown and white, trotted after him. She tended to babysit George when they were out in the yard together, and I was glad for that. Muriel's eyesight was not very good, and donkeys often helped their friends at times like those. I guessed in a year or so, when George was a little more grown and Muriel's sight was a little dimmer, he'd be leading her out to the pasture, guiding her to the troughs and water barrels. I paused with the rake in my hands and stood tall, stretching my spine and looking out at our animal family. The goats jumping on the picnic table, the ducks floating in the pond, Frida and Winnie, George and Aunt Muriel. We would have a busy, wonderful summer this year. The Tulip Farm. Out past the apple orchards and cider mills, where we went to get lost in corn mazes and buy paper bags full of fresh hot donuts in the crisp days of autumn, was a tulip farm. It was something I'd driven past 100 times without realizing what it was. Then today I'd seen a hand-painted sign of a red tulip on a yellow background with an arrow pointing the way. The sign said they were open to the public, and folks were welcome to come and pick their own. The red tulip had reminded me suddenly of a day a dozen years before. It had been the first day of May, and I'd opened up my front door to find a simple wicker basket hanging from the outside knob. It was overflowing with bright red tulips and foil-wrapped sweets and tiny, delicate stems of lilies of the valley. I remember lifting the basket right up to my face to smell the good, sweet scent of the flowers, and wondering how and why they'd been picked for me. It had taken me a day to unwind the mystery. I'd carried everything back inside and rooted through my cabinets for a bunch of tiny jars and bud vases. I put each flower in its own container to make them go as far as possible, then spread them out through the house on windowsills and side tables and a teeny ledge in the hall that seemed to have been built just for this. I went back to the basket and carefully gathered all the candies and slid them into my jacket pocket, then stepped out the front door and off down the street. I don't remember now where I'd been going. Maybe I had a class to take or a shift to work at the deli downtown. But along the way, every now and then I'd slip a candy from my pocket, unwrap it, and drop it into my mouth. There were some wrapped to look like strawberries, and I remembered that my grandmother had always had the same ones on a shelf in her sitting room. I'd laughed when I'd tasted the familiar flavor, remembering sneaking into that room to peruse the little collection of sweets in cut glass jars. It was the kind of sitting room no one actually sat in, and that meant that there were always interesting things to find in the drawers and cupboards. I used to take a few candies from the jar, pull down a heavy book with pictures of butterflies and birds and animals from all over the world, and tuck myself into the space behind the couch to slowly turn the pages until the sweets ran out. Wherever I'd been off to that day, I must have run into friends and soon found I wasn't the only one to have been visited by the spring fairy overnight. 3 or 4 of us had found baskets, all with flowers and candy, and we'd spent some time on a park bench in the sunshine trying to guess who our benefactor was. Finally, we'd spotted another friend coming toward us down the path, and we'd called out asking if she'd found a surprise on her doorstep. "No," she shrugged. "I was busy leaving them for all of you." May Day, she told us, was sometimes celebrated this way, with gifts of spring flowers and candies or baked goods. Thinking back on that May Day, the kindness of a gift given when no one was looking, and the memories that the sweets had brought back, made me turn into the gravel lot at the tulip farm. Stepping out of my car, I was greeted by the lilting call of the song sparrow, a bird whose return, along with that of the red-winged blackbird and the orange-breasted housefinch, marked the arrival of spring. The sky was a soft pale blue, with a few feathery clouds shifting with the breeze. Tulips don't have a strong smell. They aren't like those lilies of the valley or hyacinth that smell so powerfully like sweet water and greenery. But still there was a light scent in the air, like citrus and honey and cut grass. I followed a dirt trail toward the fields, glad I'd worn sturdy shoes instead of flip-flops, and as it turned to pass behind a barn, the tulip fields came into view. I thought I'd been ready for that. I wasn't. Actual goosebumps stood out on my arms, and I stopped, stock still, to give all my attention to what I was seeing. Stretching out for acres in front of me, in broad, flat, even rectangles, were bright patches in 50 colors or more. Like a panoramic picture, I turned my head to see the farthest field to the left, then slowly scanned all the way to the right, and marveled that tulips could come in so many shades. When I'd had my fill of looking and began to walk again, I spotted a man in dusty overalls with a broad-brimmed hat. He waved me over, and as I got closer, he said, "I like watching people's faces as they first see the fields. Have you been here before?" I told him I hadn't, and felt lucky to be. He fitted me out with a pair of gloves, some small garden shears, and a long, deep basket I could carry over one arm. He gave me a folded paper map with the names of the different varieties of flowers and their locations, then sent me off to gather as many as I was inclined to cut. I thought I might just wander and be led by my eyes and instincts. But looking at the card, I found some of the names so intriguing that I decided to aim for some specific plots. Some were classic in shape and color, called things like Christmas Marvel or Ruby Red or Diana. Others were streaked with color and bold lines that looked like brushstrokes. There were Rembrandts and Davenports and Marylands. Some had double blossoms or fringed petals or very thin veins of color that you could only see when you leaned down close. Into my basket went stems of the Queen of the Night, Golden Appledorn, and Dreamland. I picked enough for a few May Day baskets and to fill my own vase at home. Before I walked back to the barn to pay for my flowers and turn over my tools, I stopped and sat on a bench under a tall sycamore tree whose leaves were just budding out so that the branches looked coated in a light green haze. I thought of the baskets I'd put together with my tulips, of stopping at the candy store across from the movie theater and filling a bag with sweet pinwheels and tart lemon drops and strawberry bonbons. I'd sneak out early tomorrow morning and leave them at a few front doors. I thought that their faces in finding them might look something like mine did when I'd first seen the tulip fields. Surprise, it's spring. The story we started with today, Mother Nature, was the first bonus episode I ever wrote. And I remember the feeling of sending it out into the world and not hearing much back. We only had a handful of premium subscribers then. And after a couple of years of hundreds of thousands of monthly listeners, it was tricky to release things knowing that they might not be heard by many. And not because I was in need of the feedback, but it was because I'd created the schedule for myself, I did this, in which I must produce new stories every week with no end in sight. So I'm always looking for the next story, the next idea. And at first, that led me to hold on to thoughts, like save this one for a big story for the holidays or the anniversary show or for Halloween. And what I've learned, probably starting with this bonus episode, is that your creativity doesn't dry up. You make art, you put it out into the world, it does something or it doesn't, and then you just make more art. I was recently speaking to a creative writing class at a local college, and so many of the people in the room had a big idea for a book they wanted to write and had not actually written any of it. They were kind of stuck, they were paralyzed, and I recognized that. I get it. but holding on to one idea, afraid to start in case you fail or you lose it, now that is what creates the bottleneck of ideas. I've learned to just write with the ideas of today, to let them bubble up and be expressed, and trust that the well is deep and I can dip down for more tomorrow. In this episode, I mentioned living somewhere where lemons grew abundantly on every corner, and that is true to my real life. I don't want to brag or anything, but I used to live right at the bottom of the Amalfi Coast, one of the most beautiful places in the entire world. The lemons there are huge and much less sour than conventional grocery store lemons. I was a foreign exchange student in high school, and I spent my junior year there and lived with a wonderful family, the Carpentieri family, who I'm still very close to. I call them Mama and Papa, and I have a brother and a sister and 3 nephews there. Thinking of the lemons reminded me of a day that my papa came home from work saying that one of his colleagues who lived further up the coast had brought him a big bag of fresh lemons and had described an insalata di limone, essentially a lemon salad that the person loved having. And my mama looked at him skeptically, already knowing how this would end, but got out the ingredients he mentioned and made it. And it was slices of lemons, like peel and flesh and all, with olive oil, salt, and mint. And Papa was so sure that you could just eat it with a piece of bread on the side. His friend loved it that way. I remember watching him try not to pucker his face, taking bigger bites of bread to soften the tartness and drinking down glasses of water before admitting it was not what he'd hoped. And Mama just watching from her side of the table. They still crack me up. Another favorite exchange between them was when she would set down a dish of pasta in front of him, and he'd start to stir it around and let the steam escape, and he'd say, "It's hot, è caldo." And she'd say, "Yes, Angelo, I made it with fire." Mama's recipe for pasta al pomodoro is in my book, probably waiting on your local library's shelf right now. Go get it. And buon appetito. Now, in our second story, we went back to Weathervane Farm, which we have visited in several other episodes. Since I deliberately do not name our human characters, I go a little wild naming all the other animals. I saw recently that it's a job now to be a baby name consultant, and I would like to hang out my shingle, as it were, as an animal name consultant. And just to show my bona fides, animals I have named include Broccoli the dog, solid, Velcro the cat, Salsiccia Maria Francesca Valentina Maria Nicolai Spicer the dachshund, long name, but she was a long dog, Fish Sticks the cat, and of course Geraldine, Winnie the Moo, Topper, Crumb. So hey, let me know if you need me to consult on names for your furry or feathered friends. Also, a good word, and one that I first learned for a special story in my book, is a Tagalog word pronounced gigil, and it means an overwhelming feeling of joy in reference to something cute, as well as the wish to squeeze it. It's what we sometimes call cuteness aggression, and those runner duck chicks, you'd want to squeeze them. And I know I use the word ducklets instead of ducklings. I think it's cuter. Try and stop me. Finally, we spent some time among the tulips in our last story. I get to spend a good bit of the year very close to Holland, Michigan, which overflows with tulips and all things Dutch, especially in the spring. And those fields are truly astonishing, so I recommend a visit if you can make it. Also, the story about May Day is a real one. I had a friend in college who was an amazing gift giver, the kind who would remember some small offhand comment and then turn it into something amazing 6 months later. She left a May Day basket on our door, and it felt like magic. And I did my best to repay her by suggesting she name her new kitten Fish Sticks, and the legend was born. Thanks, Liz. And thanks to you for being here with me on this trip through the village of nothing much. We'll be back next week with more simple stories of ordinary magic. Till then, let's be good to one another.